With this new bill, it means mass shooters in Colorado will have to get training before they get their gun. So Colorado could be the state that has the best trained mass shooters in the country, which is backwards for public safety, because sometimes would-be mass shooters, because they're not very proficient with guns sometimes, mess up and commit errors that lead to them being killed sooner than otherwise and getting stopped. But thanks to Governor Polis and Senator Sullivan and Senator Gonzalez, Colorado mass shooters are going to be competent and well-trained and won't be making rookie mistakes.
What is the state of the Second Amendment in the state of Colorado? We're going to find out. But first, subscribe and like our channel. Click that little bell icon for notifications, and find the Devil's Advocate podcast on your favorite listening app. The one, the only, the lovely and talented Dave Kopel. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the Second Amendment being treated in Colorado?
Well, it depends what you're comparing it to. Compared to totalitarian gun-banning dictatorships, like, say, Communist China or Vietnam or North Korea, we're in quite good shape relative to them. Compared to other American states, we've now become one of the worst. Every year in the legislatures around the nation, there are various bills passed, and many bills are only enacted by a few of the most extremist states. Colorado is now one of those most extremist states. For example, we have laws that only exist elsewhere in New York or California, and some others that only exist in a handful of the worst other states, such as Illinois, for example.
So, growing up in Colorado, this was a Western state, still a Western state, and the idea of gun control was unthinkable, that to take away somebody's right to keep and bear arms. And I would look at catalogs and online to buy things, and some items would have this little disclaimer: not available in California, New York, and Massachusetts. Never in my wildest dream would I think that Colorado would be the next on that list of coastal, left-wing, gun-phobic states. But here we are.
Well, here we are because we, as you say, we are geographically a Western state, but we're not governed by the people who settled the state, the people who grew and built it, nor by the liberal Democrats of my dad's political era from the 1960s through the 1990s. We are governed by people who self-identify as hating America, thinking that this country is fundamentally racist. And if you hate America, then all the more you hate the West, because the West has always been the most American part of America, where you can make a fresh start, create yourself the way you want to be an individual. It's one of the reasons my parents, who were from mixed religious backgrounds, and he was from Maryland, she was from Iowa, why they decided to stay in Colorado after meeting at the University of Colorado, because your background doesn't matter, or didn't matter, in the great Colorado that they chose.
The Colorado you and I grew up in, people could write their own biography. They could take risk. And part of that was defending yourself. And a gun was not just a symbol, but it was a tool that many Coloradans used on the farms and in the fields. And it was welcomed. I mean, we've had Democratic legislatures and Democratic governors for many years. Roy Romer, Dick Lamb never would have signed what has been signed in the last decade in Colorado. And
you may be giving Lamb and Romer too much credit on that.
Really?
They, I don't know, there wasn't much chance of extreme anti-gun bills getting through the legislatures when they were governors, so we never got that tested.
Let me ask you this. our governor likes to have this patina of being a libertarian. And I guess it's because he's pro-pot. But the gun issue is one of the worst issues to say he was libertarian. But he has been magnificent at taking a huge anti-gun bill and then chopping it down to something that's just ugly, including Senate Bill 3, which started as an assault weapon ban, a so-called assault weapon ban. I argue that what was passed is worse than an assault weapon ban, because I believe any so-called assault weapon ban is going to be overturned by the United States Supreme Court at some point. I'm not certain about what's happened here, but I look at what they have done with red flag laws, what they've done with magazine laws, what they've done with waiting periods, what they've done now with Senate Bill 3, and I've never thought Colorado would have this brutal attack. Is Polis a libertarian when it comes to the Second Amendment?
If left to his own devices, yes. And you can look at his voting record when he was a U.S. representative, and it was a moderate voting record on gun issues in the U.S. House of Representatives for the most part. But then he ran for governor, and he was running against Mike Johnston, who was Bloomberg's favorite guy, enormous amount of money.
And for those who don't know, Michael Bloomberg is the major funder in America against guns.
Right, except for the ones he has himself. His security guards are actually retired ex-New York Police Department, so by federal law, they get a lot of exemptions from the gun controls that the little people have to obey. So do you think Michael Bloomberg's security guards go around with 10-round magazines? I'd suggest his security guards have enough firepower.
Gun control for thee, not for me, obviously.
That's right. And he was asked about it. They said, well, I'm very important and rich, which is true.
Well, damn it, I'm very important. I'm not wealthy, but don't I have the same right to self-defense as he does?
Based on a philosophy of God-given human rights, which is the Declaration of Independence that this Independence Institute is named after, and based on the Colorado Constitution, which also says that rights are inherent and fundamental and precede government, and one of those inherent, fundamental, inalienable rights is the right of self-defense. But that the Colorado General Assembly couldn't care less about constitutional rights or obeying the law in general.
I asked you about Polis. Is Polis libertarian when it comes to the Second Amendment?
Unless it's politically advantageous not to be.
He has tried his best not to sign a so-called assault weapons bill. If it had one landed on his desk, he'd have to sign it because you can't become president and run through a Democratic primary without it. But what he has signed has been horrific. Give me just a quick summary of what's happened under the Polis years in gun control here in the state.
Well, let's get the particular bill that he's about to sign, Senate Bill 3.
By the time this airs, it will be law.
Yes. So the bill came from the extreme end of the Colorado legislature, the people who make no bones about how much they hate gun owners and gun ownership in particular, and are extremely hostile, violating legislative decorum against when witnesses try to disagree with that point of view. The bill started off as a ban. It wouldn't take away somebody's existing guns, but it would make future sales and all transfers, like giving a gun to your adult child, illegal. Polis, to his credit, made that not as bad, and it changed from a prospective ban into a very onerous licensing bill. Now, the funny thing is, this bill is supposedly about preventing mass shooters, which is a lie. But that's the pretext of this. And with this new bill, it means mass shooters in Colorado will have to get training before they get their gun. So Colorado could be the state that has the best trained mass shooters in the country, which is backwards for public safety, because sometimes would-be mass shooters, because they're not very proficient with guns sometimes, mess up and commit errors that lead to them being killed sooner than otherwise and getting stopped. But thanks to Governor Polis and Senator Sullivan and Senator Gonzalez, Colorado mass shooters are going to be competent and well-trained and won't be making rookie mistakes.
They will have 12 hours of training under their belt before they can buy their mass shooting device. And by the way, some mass shooters buy their guns legally. Some steal their guns. So we can only hope that the mass shooters of the future under this will be those who steal guns, not those who bought them legally and received 12 hours of training to get a permission slip from the government to own their constitutionally guaranteed right. What does this bill do specifically?
It applies to all semi-automatic, that is self-loading, rifles and shotguns that use detachable magazines.
And pistols, right?
Well, we're going to get to that. So for the shotguns, that's a fairly discrete category. Most shotguns don't use detachable magazines. Some do. A huge number of rifles use detachable magazines. It applies to all of those except for .22 caliber and except for a named list of 40 exempt type models, which was Dylan Roberts' price for voting for the bill. So that
what is special about those 40 models? He has them, or he wants to buy them?
They're very popular. They're guns from like Ruger, Winchester, classic American firearms. They're not functionally different from the other guns that are subject to this law, but we've got at least this carve out of some traditional guns, some of which go back to the early 1900s.
Like an N1 Garand or something like that, or?
I'm not sure if the M1, if the Garand is
or
on
Mini
the list.
14,
the Ruger Mini 14 is definitely on the list.
What the hell? All right, so for those who don't know, an AR-15 is an evil, awful, terrible weapon of war because it has black polymer on it.
Right.
But if it has a wood stock, apparently it's a nice gun, even though it is functionally the same. So a Ruger Mini 14 is exactly the same as an AR, except one has a wood stock, the other one has a polymer black evil looking stock, and therefore one is okay and one is not okay, even though they are functionally exactly the same.
Right, functionally the same in that every semi-automatic fires one shot when you pull the trigger. So every semi-automatic of any type fires at that rate. It's as fast as your finger can repeatedly press the trigger. And you're right, semi-automatics, whether in the special exempt category or not, compared to other guns, they don't fire ammunition that is more powerful, faster, anything like that.
Right, and people should know these so-called assault weapons are not machine guns. In order to get a machine gun, you need to go through a special federal permitting process. It's very difficult. They're not being made anymore by law. So it's
actually easier now in Colorado to buy a machine gun than it will be to buy a common semi-automatic rifle. If you have the money. Okay. The 1986 Congressional Firearms Owners Protection Act made a lot of reforms in federal gun control laws, but it had a hostile amendment attached, which became law, that said from May 19th, 1986 onward, no new machine guns for ordinary American citizens. Fine for machine guns for the government machine guns like police departments and the EPA and things like that, Department of Agriculture. They've sextupled actually since 1986. We've got a lot more machine guns in government hands than we used to. But for regular, ordinary citizens, you can definitely buy a machine gun, but it's got to be one manufactured before May 19th, 1986. And there's, of course, the collector's issue, and that it raises the price.
Right.
But if you can afford a machine gun, which will be several $1,000s on up, then to buy one, you have to go through a permission process with the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. But it's really, these days, you can file your fingerprints online. The dealer will help you fill the proper forms, And ATF, to its credit, under the Biden administration, got much, much faster at processing these applications. So
But
you
in
can get,
Colorado, are you telling me that after Senate Bill 3 becomes law, it will be easier for someone, if they have the money, to get a fully automatic machine gun? Brrr, pull the trigger once, lots of bullets go flying, compared to just a regular, common, semi-automatic self-loading rifle.
exactly. You can, if you get the brakes, you can buy a machine gun in less than a week.
And you don't have to go through 12 hours of training.
Nope.
That's this new law.
Yes.
This is what I love about gun control. And you might even remember me from way back when I used to be anti-gun. And I had the emotion about these things, and I couldn't tell the difference between a machine gun and a semi-automatic, between what is an AR-15 and now what is still legal, a Mini-14. Well, it doesn't take that long to understand that this is all about emotion. This is not about saving lives. This is about disarming legal, law-abiding citizens. All right, so that's what happens with rifles. What about pistols?
The modern United States, if you go to buy a handgun in a store, about 4/5 of the handguns that people buy are modern semi-automatic pistols, like a Glock, Ruger, Smith & Wesson, Colt, all Taurus,
Right.
all those brands. And the remainder are old-fashioned revolvers, wheel guns, where they have a cylinder that revolves. So this bill applies to almost all semi-automatic handguns. There's an exception for .22 caliber, which is a very puny little caliber used for plinking at tin cans. But for any gun caliber that would be useful for self-defense, it applies to all of those. And in fact, it applies to every semi-automatic handgun, with the exception of one model that is now a collector's item that was made by Beretta and was last sold in the 1990s. Other than that Beretta, every other semi-automatic centerfire pistol this applies to.
Basically, for those people who don't understand guns too well, except that they're bad, this law now applies to nearly every gun that is sold. Yeah, revolvers are different and actually much more expensive. Semi-automatics are the guns that are in most common usage and most popular. And so, and everyone has them. So I want to buy a pistol. What do I have to do?
Well, you have to go through, there's two different paths, depending on whether you've had hunter safety, you have a hunter safety certification or not. And hunter safety, I've done it. I have the card. That is a long process.
I've done it as well. It is a very long, detailed process.
Yeah, it's.
And I recommend it. It's a great thing.
I think it's probably well over 30 hours of instruction.
Yeah.
Which in Colorado, the way I did it is I could do most of the classes online, and then we had a final class where we had the test in person. And that's fine for hunting. So if you have...
Was your test like mine, where you actually could choose to hunt a deer for the final test, or a human being? I paid extra for that.
We only shot squirrels. Now, actually, what the way my real class was we met at a sporting goods store in one of their side rooms, and then went down to the Colorado Department of Wildlife, where everybody had to just fire one shot from a rifle at an indoor range to show some basic competence in gun handling. So you can have hunter safety, which is dozens of hours, and then if you have that, then I believe it's 4 hours more of additional instruction. Or if you don't start with that, then you have to take a 12-hour class. The 12-hour class has to be on at least 2 days and has to be 100% in person. And on top of this, besides the classes, there's a multi-layered application process. There's 3 different steps where you have to take a fee. And these 3 different steps where somebody else has to give you authorization to move forward to the next step. On none of these is there any limit on the fee, and on none of these is there any rule that the government official has to make a decision, like to deny or approve you within a certain time period. Now you can contrast that with a reasonable gun control law, which is Colorado's Concealed Carry Act. That says you apply to a sheriff for a concealed carry permit, you need to bring in certain documentation, including your safety training, which a concealed carry safety training is not good enough to buy on this new gun purchase bill. But the sheriff has to make a decision, either grant the permit or deny the permit within a certain period of time. None of that applies to this. You can be stuck in bureaucratic limbo forever.
Back in the old days when Arapahoe County Sheriff Sullivan, for instance, a huge anti-gunner,
who later went to prison for sexual abuse of teenagers and giving them meth in exchange for sex.
That very one. He was so anti-gun, he would never give out a concealed carry permit,
right?
Which is why the state changed the laws. So you could now have guys like that in position of power in different sheriff's offices, and it could be years before you get the permission slip to go take the class to then maybe get your gun.
Multi-layer step. You need the local sheriff, but also the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife. Most sheriffs, because they are elected by the people, actually like the people and are supportive of them and are generally supportive of Second Amendment rights.
Not always the case. Remember, the Denver sheriff, for a long time, the chief of police in Denver, never let out any concealed permits.
Right. Well, the Denver.
So you can have pockets of gun hatred.
Yes, you can.
Boulder, Denver, maybe Aspen.
Well, that's because in Denver and in Broomfield, people can't elect the sheriff.
Right.
The sheriff is a political appointee. In all the other counties, the sheriff is elected by the people, and the vast majority of them are supportive of civil rights. But so there's the sheriff, but of course they're busy too. But there's a sheriff step, and then there's another step with the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife, which is now turned into a gun licensing agency.
How much is this going to cost me when I want to go and buy a new semi-automatic pistol? How much is this going to cost? Assume I don't have any hunter certification.
Well, we have no idea what the private providers of the classes will charge whatever they want. A 12-hour class, that's a lot of time. And then the government fees on top of that, it said you can cover your direct and indirect costs. So you not only pay for the time that for example, a Parks and Wildlife employee spends processing your application, you got to pay for the air conditioning in the building, for the cost of acquiring the building, for the pension fund, for the state employees, whatever they can add on as indirect costs, they will. And so one of the effects of this, of course, is, as Einstein proved, time is money. And rich people have more money, and they can use that to organize their time well. On the other hand, a poor person, let's say a single mom working a job and a half, raising 2 kids, doesn't have that kind of work time flexibility to get off and leave her kids alone for 12 hours of instruction, and may not have the surplus on a month-to-month basis to pay these fees, which will certainly run cumulatively into the hundreds of dollars. But again, that's disarming anybody, but starting with poor people is the point of this. These are not gun control advocates. Gun control advocates think that guns are fine, but you want to keep them out of the hands of people who are going to misuse them. You want people to not behave recklessly. They have laws, some of which I'd agree with, some of which I don't. These are gun prohibition people. Their hatred is palpable. You can see it. Everybody at the legislature who watches these people, and Tom Sullivan, I mean you, Senator Julie Gonzalez, and among others, their bigotry and malice is worn on their sleeves as their badge of honor.
Eric Sonderman, who you know, when I asked how and why are they doing these type of things, this crazy, wild, progressive laws, and he came up with 3 words: because they can. Because this legislature is so out of touch with the people, and they hate guns. And every single session, there is another attack on guns. The idea that you have to have a waiting period in order to enjoy your constitutionally guaranteed rights, I want them to try that for a 3-day waiting period before you can go to your mosque and worship, which is also protected.
Well, and all these talking points they have, they're just, nobody really believes them. So for example, when the waiting period bill was going through, the justification, which was actually put, it's in the statute, it's in the legislative findings. There's an article from, it's called the PNAS Journal, which PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And this journal article said waiting periods are really good and they reduce homicides. They also, this same journal article, the one that they cited as the justification for passing their waiting period law, also said background checks don't accomplish anything. So if they actually believed in their PNAS article, they might have passed the waiting period, but then they would have also repealed the ridiculous expansion of background checks that they enacted in 2013 that says if you lend your gun to a neighbor for 5 days, both of you have to go to a gun store to process handing over to the neighbor and fill out the forms as if you were selling the gun to the neighbor. And then 5 days later, when the neighbor gives you the gun back, you got to go back to the gun store to get your own gun back as if you were buying a new gun and pay all the fees and forms for that.
They are making gun ownership more and more out of reach for more Coloradans, including the more recent sales tax, an extra 6% on every gun, every accessory, every round of ammunition.
Yeah.
And so what's happening is, like so many things that progressives do, it's to screw poor people. If you've got money, fine, an extra $50 in taxes isn't bad. If you've got money, the extra couple $100 to get to go through the process, fine. You're an inner city person and you don't have the money for this. You want to defend yourself. You want to be able to defend your family. They are putting that out of reach.
Oh, John, you use the word progressive. And I know they self-identify that way. But, you know, there's been times, obviously, at the office, I'll share this, when you've come in and you said you identify as a slender, beautiful female ballerina. And
which I am, thank you very much.
Yes. And you can identify like that and call yourself that. And likewise, the majority of the legislature can call themselves progressives, but they are so not. They are regressives. They want to regress us back to a distant past when there were no individual rights, when it was the government has the say in everything, and the government decides things for the people because the government knows better than the people. The idea of inherent human rights of the Declaration of Independence that we're founded on, of the Colorado Constitution's Bill of Rights, articles, sections 1 through 3 that lay out these human rights, they hate those things. They want power for themselves to impose on everyone else the way they think they should because they're so superior and wiser than the public. And they are, in that respect, regressing us back to, for example, ages of religious totalitarianism in the Middle Ages, where the bishop in an area thinks he's got the ability to tell everyone else what to think and how to worship.
People of color are statistically less wealthy. This is also a racist, bigoted move. All of this is to keep the guns out of hands of people of color. I think it's pretty clear that's part of this as well. They'll never admit that, but that's exactly what it is. There'll be a lawsuit. Is this constitutional from your point of view?
Don't know. We'll have to see on that. I'll give you quickly the arguments on both sides. One is the Supreme Court's decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin said you should enforce the Second Amendment based on its text and its original meaning. And that original meaning can be elucidated by subsequent legislation that people thought was consistent with that. But original meaning is shown by an enactment from 1810 is a lot more powerful than trying to say something from 1895 or 1972 tells you anything about original meaning. And under that approach, this extremely harsh licensing bill is far out of bounds. There was never anything enacted like that for people who had civil rights. The only parallels are licensing laws that were applied to people who didn't have full civil rights, like free people of color in North Carolina, for example, or maybe Indians who at the time were not even citizens of the United States in most cases. So that's the argument against it. The argument for it is the Bruin decision, which said New York can't have a law that says nobody gets a concealed carry permit unless they prove they have some special need. That's unconstitutional. But footnote 9 in that opinion says we don't mean to cast doubt on shall issue licensing laws, which is like what Colorado has, which is you have to go through a process to get a concealed carry permit. And if you meet all the metrics, the standards, you pass the background check, you don't have crazy behavior that's known to the sheriff, things like that. You pass the safety training class. All of those things, then the sheriff shall issue a permit. And the Supreme Court said that's okay. So the gun prevention lobbies take that footnote 9 and say what the Supreme Court said about concealed carry permits applies just as much to any other permit, like just to have a gun in your home, just to buy a gun. And so licensing's fine. And then you get the questions, well, the Supreme Court said you can't have long waiting times or exorbitant fees. But then you got to get into the details of that. And on top of that, what the Supreme Court approved of was shall issue. You shall issue and you shall make a decision within a time period certain. This law doesn't do that. It's not shall, it's whenever, do it if you feel like it, and no guarantee at all on when it'll be issued, if ever.
When does this law go into effect? Because I've heard it was next August when Polis only has a few months left of being governor.
Right. It would have, normally bills, unless something's different, they go into effect on July 1st. This one has gotten pushed back to August of 2026, and that's partly for the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife to gear itself up to become a gun licensing agency.
Quick question on that one.
Oh, and by the way, the fiscal note on that, it's been discovered recently by activists on the through Freedom of Information Act requests. The fiscal note on this is like, what's it going to cost Parks and Wildlife to do this? What fees are they going to charge? How many people are going to apply? The fiscal note was a deliberate lie. The fiscal note writers said, we've got no idea on this. And yet the lie becomes a law now.
Let's switch this conversation a little bit. Talk to me like I was when I was younger. And I was emotionally
Oh, John, isn't it nice to be able to make love to a woman once in a while?
If only I could find one. When I hated guns, I looked at guns the way I think a lot of Coloradans now look at guns, as if they have free will, as if they have a personality, as if they are symbols, as if they're swastikas. And I just wanted them to go away, and that a good society wouldn't need those. It was studying a lot of the research you did, a lot of research others did, taking apart guns, looking at their safeties, internal and external safeties, actually getting my hands on guns, working with them, that slowly melted away that fear so I could look at it. So there are people looking at this going, wait a second, come on, Dave. All this requires is that people get some frickin' training on how to do that. We have it for cars. Young people just can't go drive a car until they're 18, and they can. They don't need any training after 18. But isn't it more like that these things are by their very design dangerous? And so 12 hours of inconvenience is a small price to pay for a much safer Colorado.
Well, I'd partly agree with that in the sense that our Concealed Carry Act requires a training class as well. But the concealed carry training can be mainly online, but it's got to have an in-person component. And the training requirements for that are just designed for exactly the things you were talking about, so that you get people up, make sure everybody has a level of basic competence and knowledge of safe handling of firearms and what the laws are. These classes are much worse than that. First of all, if you've passed hunter safety, you've already been through that whole thing on how to handle a long gun, especially. safely. That's hunter safety includes a lot of things: water safety, outdoorsmanship, all
There's
kinds of
also,
stuff.
by the way, there's hunting with handguns as well.
That's right. And hunter safety, you need that as well. So hunter safety's already given you that. And then to say, if you have to have hunter safety, we're going to layer still more on top of that. Or to say, if you haven't had hunter safety, we'll give you, you can get a permit to carry a handgun for a half-day class, which is sufficient to teach for the basics. But to simply buy a shotgun in your own home, you got to have 12 hours. That's not aiming for better
It is
training.
made, let's just be honest, it's made to discourage gun
Yes.
ownership.
Yes.
That's all this is to
Yeah.
get people not to do it. Why in the world does my concealed weapons permit is not sufficient for that? I mean, including for background checks. If I've got a concealed carry permit, why do I have to go through a background check when I went through a super duper background check to get that?
Right.
And now we've got the wildlife department, who has nothing to do with guns. They're not there
Well, they
to
supervise.
trade.
They manage the hunting.
Right, but they don't care whether it's a semi-automatic or fully automatic or whatever. Why is it that the guys who count how many deer are out there are now going to be in charge of training us? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
A long-term effective strategy of the gun prevention lobbies, like the Bloomberg organization, is to build institutions over the long term. That's smart. We're a long-term institution and we've made a difference. They're building their long-term institutions to embed gun prevention in as many parts of the state government as possible. So they have the governor's office of gun prevention. It's technically called gun violence prevention, but they consider self-defense to be gun violence. So it's gun prevention overall. You've got now the Department of Parks and Wildlife becoming a gun prevention agency. And also in this bill, within the State Department, Department of Revenue, there is a new office for a bill from last year for the state licensing of gun dealers. And that division within the Department of Revenue is also going to be involved in the enforcement, including the criminal law enforcement with paid, gun carrying state police to enforce this law. So we've got already 3 different gun prevention organizations permanently now.
We're building
as part
up
of our
an
state
anti-gun
government.
bureaucracy that you
Yeah.
have to manage in order to get it. If I get
Yes.
my certification to go get the class, I take the class, I'm assuming that's good for the rest of my life.
No, for 5 years.
So if 5 years and a day I want to buy a new pistol, I got to do this whole thing all over again?
Yes, you do.
I don't even have to do that with my driver's license.
Right. You don't need to take the driving test you took the first time you got the license, nor do you need to take the written test that shows that stop, red means stop, and that if the speed limit says 55, you should go under that speed.
For the sake of time, I want to talk about culture.
Yeah.
We always say at Independence that politics is a lagging indicator of culture.
Yes.
And obviously the culture in Colorado has changed from an independent state where people believe in their own independence to a collectivist state where you've got to get permission from government to live
I
your
don't
life.
agree with that. I think the culture at the legislature has changed. I don't think Coloradans have changed that drastically.
I would argue that they did pass a law at the ballot box to penalize us with a 6% tax, and they did put in these clowns, these bigoted clowns. So there's something there as well.
Well, yes, they passed the statute to say a 6.5% tax on guns and ammunition, but it passed by a pretty narrow margin. And there's a lot of, as you know, on taxes in general, there's a lot of people who have what Russell Long, the longtime chair of Senate Finance, supposedly said is, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree. So, yeah.
It's like cigarette taxes or
Ex-
hotel taxes. I'm not taxing me, I'm taxing somebody else.
Exactly. So that's a long-term deficiency of just the political economy. But the extremism in the legislature And the power of the hate groups in the legislature right now is not so much, I think, the people of Colorado really voting for that, but this state, for whatever reasons, has, like me, a high aversion to Donald Trump. And so any Democrat, no matter how ridiculous, you saw, Leslie Herod was, and others, crazy, literally crazy characters based on their behavior, have been elected to the legislature because they were running as Democrats in a state that, generally speaking, doesn't like the Republican brand because it doesn't like Donald Trump. And I wish Colorado voters would be a little more discerning about the whole thing, and they'd say, sure, I'm going to vote for a Republican for the House or U.S. House or U.S. Senate because I want somebody to fight Trump. That's fine. That's the federal level. But you're not doing anything really to fight Trump when you elect malicious extremists who are going to harm Coloradans to run the legislature just because they say they're against Trump too.
Talking about culture, let me put out my concern. And almost uniformly, beat cops, the guys on the street, are very pro-gun.
Yeah.
They understand guns. They've been trained with guns. They carry guns. They understand guns, and they want citizens to have guns.
And they also understand that when seconds count, the police are minutes away.
Right, exactly. However, my concern with all these gun laws that have been building up decade after decade is that we're bifurcating our citizenry, in that the beautiful thing about law enforcement is that those police, unlike other countries where they're thugs of whatever regime is in power, they are us. They're the guys you see at church, the guys at the cocktail parties, the guy at the barbecue. They come from our world. And that is crucial so that we don't live in a police state. But now we're building over time a system where citizens are disarmed, but police officers are allowed to be armed like militias. So they can have the machine guns, we can't. In Colorado, they can have normal capacity magazines up to however many rounds they want.
Which would be standard, the 30 for some rifles.
Right. They can have these rifles, we can't. They can get them without waiting for 3 days, we have to. And over time, because I'm not thinking about our generation, I'm thinking about the next and the next and the next, we're going to build a system where we empower a police state and disempower citizens, including people of color. This scares the hell out of me. Tell me I don't have anything to worry about.
You should worry a lot, and that this is another example of the General Assembly's majority being so regressive. The society you just described of the police are a superior class above the people rather than being of the people takes us back to the time before, Robert Peel's creation of the first modern police in London in the 1830s and 1840s. And his point was the police are just a specialized group of people who do what all citizens have an obligation to do, which is keep their communities safe, including using force when necessary. And the police are just some people who happen to do that full time, and other citizens, do it when the occasion arises. This is back to the era of the serfs are disarmed and the knights have the weapons. This is the system that's used in every totalitarian society. As Ronald Reagan said, guns are called the great equalizer, and it means that, in one sense, that for example, a small woman can defend herself against several larger male attackers. But he went on to say, they're also a great equalizer in a much bigger sense, that in every totalitarian country, the first thing they do is take away the people's guns when they take over, because that's what enables the secret police to operate with impunity. And you don't have to go all the way to full Stalinism to see how that affects the culture. In Great Britain, people still do, to some extent, legally own shotguns, for sporting purposes, and rifles to a more limited extent. But the public is disarmed from having a firearm for self-defense or a handgun at all. And this is a country where just a couple of weeks ago, somebody criticizes the local government on social media, and 6 police officers show up at 4 a.m. to sanction that person, where people go to jail literally for 31 months for a hateful, bad tweet, whereas people who perpetrate extensive rapes, grooming gangs, mainly Pakistani immigrants, against lower class white British girls get minimal sentences or none at all, and you're not even supposed to talk about that. And I'm not saying that the 11-year-old girls who were getting gang raped by the Pakistani immigrants, that they would be, in another world, they would have been carrying a gun and would have shot them. But I'm saying it's a culture of submission, a culture of the jackboot is on us and we can't do anything about it, so we just have to go along with it. And that's increasingly what Britain, which used to be one of the great models of liberty in the world, is like, and it's what you increasingly see throughout the world, and it is ultimately the model that the regressives here are moving us towards.
We gunnies despise gun registration. We fear it because in every country that it has happened, sooner or later, it turns into gun confiscation.
Yeah.
It seems like all these things that they're doing are basically backdoor gun registrations. That if I've got to go and take a government-sanctioned, government-administered class where it's open records who went to that class, they know that I'm a gun owner.
Well, your sheriff's office, once you take the class, then the private instructor who does the class has to transmit a notice that you passed the class to the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office would keep that on file. And the sheriff's office has to process the application for stage 2 of you wanting to buy a handgun, for a semi-automatic handgun. So the sheriff's office would have permanent records, and likewise the Colorado Department of Parks and Wildlife would have a permanent record of you as being within this 5-year window of being allowed to buy a normal semi-automatic handgun. So absolutely, it's a permanent registration list. Although the bill, which is the typical lies of the gun prevention movement, says, oh, this is not a list, this Parks and Wildlife list is not necessarily a list that a person owns a particular handgun or is a gun owner. Right, I just took the class.
I just wanted to take the class.
I love standardized tests. I passed the plumber's exam too, although I wouldn't even know don't even own a pipe wrench.
For those people like I was, who are scared about guns, the biggest thing you can do is to learn about guns. What I find so insulting is how people with no real knowledge of guns are the ones passing laws about them. Now, I get why you might be like Diana DeGette, and who said, well, we need these magazine laws. And I asked, well, what do you do with the old ones? She said, oh, once they use them, they throw them away, so they'll just go away. Not understanding that a magazine is like a Pez dispenser, you get to refill them as long as you've got it.
And when we were doing the Colorado sheriff's case a decade ago, and my sheriff clients were being deposed, one of the lawyers for the Attorney General's office was asking, oh, where does your office buy magazines from? Completely reasonable question, and typically we buy them in large quantities from various mail order places. And then the lawyer says, oh, do the magazines come filled? Like, Midway USA is like, yeah, we need a bunch of 17-round magazines for our Glock pistols, but can you load the 9mm rounds in there beforehand? We can't. Can you pre-fill the magazines?
And by the way,
us?
if you don't know about guns, I fully understand why you wouldn't know the answer to that question, but I don't expect that person to be making laws about something they have no knowledge of. So they just take Bloomberg stuff and go. All right, so let me just see if we can finish up on this. Since Polis has been in office, we've got red flag laws, we've got waiting period laws. They have taken away.
We've got 23 different laws overall in
23 different laws.
Well, starting with Hickenlooper, since Since 2013, we've had nearly 24, and the number's going to grow, obviously. So maybe by the time this airs, we'll be well over 24 anti-gun laws enacted in the past dozen years. And they all said it's going to make Colorado safer. Well, we've gone from being one of the lowest crime states to being now one of the very worst states for violent crime.
They've taken away our ability to carry concealed in more and more places.
Yeah.
In other words, you can defend yourself with a concealed carry permit, but just not in the places you'll need it. So cities that are anti-gun will say, no, you can't carry you can have a permit, you just can't use it.
So when you're jogging through Washington Park in Denver, or City Park, or Boulder Open Space, as a woman at 6 o'clock in the morning by yourself, they insist that you be helpless, whether you get attacked by a predator animal in Boulder or predator humans in either place. They don't want people to protect themselves. And this gets back to the whole point of the gun ban lobbies back from when they were originally formed in the 1970s. They're willing to, most of them, willing to accept the existence of strictly regulated hunting, and I think hunting should be regulated, severely regulated hunting and target shooting. But the idea of somebody using a firearm for self-defense is, in their view, immoral and disorderly. And that's something that only the government should do.
Which is why women especially need to learn about guns. It's why minorities especially need to learn about guns, because they're coming after you. You're the folks that need it the most. So for what I love is how the
well,
left,
besides women and minorities of all types, Jewish safety is a lot less secure in this country than it was when I was growing up.
and those people who hate the police are passing laws to empower the police and disempower themselves. And it's as if they haven't quite thought out the whole equation yet.
Trumpian thinking, where you can at most think one move ahead in checkers, is not, as we've seen, is not a characteristic solely of Donald Trump. It applies to many of the regressives. Although some of the progressives, they understand how they're building up the structure for long-term prohibition.
Real fast, a plug for the work you do at Independence. Since we've been friends, which has got to be 30-something years now, you have been one of the nation's eminent scholars on Second Amendment issues, the founders' meaning of the Second Amendment. Your work was crucial in the Heller decision, the McDonald decision, the Bruen decision, that the amicus work that you have done has saved gun rights. So that I put as a pledge. Help me pay this man's salary and throw a few bucks to Independence Institute if you care about the Second Amendment. If you don't care about the Second Amendment, learn about it. Dave, thank you so very much. And until next week, think freedom.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.